Great. Now I just realized with horror that the timer I've been using is a few minutes behind, and I want to make sure that we get you out get you out of this on time. So are there any questions from the audience? If you could please use the microphone so that anyone watching on the web isn't completely baffled by what the responses are, that would be great. And first question over there.
I'd like to go back to the disaster issue. So, Jeffrey, you mentioned that there's a good, strong industry out there that knows how to respond to that, at least in some way. That's the side of the question that I come from. So my question to all of you from a microbiome point of view is, when restorers go in to fix buildings, and not just the ones that are horribly damaged by the storm that's obvious, but the ones on the fringes of the storm that are kind of damaged, okay? So it's not so obvious that they have to do something. What we don't know how to do is really return that building to a condition so it will have a reasonable microbiome. I'm not talking about manipulating the microbiome, but just creating conditions again so that it is something reasonable, because we have no idea what's going on other than some of them count spores and it's below a certain threshold, so they call it good. That's not good enough. We need a lot of help from all of you.
One first thing I would say in response is that I think this is where next generation sequencing and microbiome is going to be very, very helpful, because fungus really is the major problem that comes in from flooding and from storm damage. There are experts in the audience, I know, who are mycologists and who can attest to what happens. And I think being able to identify them, being able to determine and characterize so you know how to deal with them, to know what disinfectants to use appropriately, I think that's one of the first orders of business. And that's where I think the microbiome and the ability not just to focus on bacteria, which we've been able to easily culture, and a little bit more easily culture viruses, but to get at the problem of fungus and parasites that we haven't been able to get a hold of because they're hard to get into culture or to understand. But I think now we have the tools, and I think this is one of the big contributions of the microbiome and next generation sequencing.
I would just add one piece to that, Carl. I think there's also a very important occupational health issue of the people who actually go in and do the restoring in these environments. And I think that's another place where I think that there could be some immediate insight on what needs to be done, if anything, to protect those actually doing the work.
I'll add one last thing, which is that I think that in terms of manipulating our environments, much like antibiotics, where we're moving away potentially from kind of these broad spectrum antibiotics and more towards targeted approaches, potentially. They have still yet to go through the FDA pipeline and everything. But I wonder in the built environment if there's that same opportunity for more targeted intervention. So if there is a certain fungi growing on a house or whatever, that we have a targeted method for dispersing or getting rid of whatever potentially toxic specimen.
Great. Another question over here.
Jesse Ossabel, Rockefeller University. My question is about instruments. If you had one wish that could be fulfilled overnight, what instrument would you like to have tomorrow? Would it be something that's smaller than what we have today? Would it be something that gives a result more quickly? Would it be something that samples a larger volume of air or a type of surface that can't yet be sampled accurately? Any thoughts about instruments that could really transform our field?
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. We're all jumping at it.
What I want is a mass spec I can put on my phone and scan everything from like this water bottle to something the size of this auditorium. But I realize there's a fairly large number of technical challenges involved in that. I'll let the others comment.
Oh, no, you were going to.
So I was going to say a device that could measure the water available to microorganisms rapidly and non-destructively.
A real-time sequencer the size of your iPhone that can give you sequence data in for under $10 a sample.
How are you going to do the sample prep for it, though?
Pardon me?
What about sample prep?
What about sample prep? I think that can be put, using microfluidics, you would also want to have some methodology for cost-effective sample prep, yeah. I thought we only got one wish, though.
Mm-hmm. Get all of them together. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think combining those is really important, because if you still need, a $50,000 robot to do the sample prep, it's less convenient to have the sequencing on your phone.
This is a hard question, but I would also say that we're probably getting closer to having sample preps and sequencers that we can hold in our hands and do in relatively short time, but I still think that categorizing metabolites is still a very hard challenge. We're nowhere near being able to do that very quickly or in high throughput or in our hands.
Well, what I'd like to have is the device that just zaps and gives you the sequence without having to take the sample.
Right.
That's why I want the mass spec.
Or a tricorder type of thing where you can look at something and not only would it diagnose the person, but it would also give you a readout on what organisms are there, but not only that, but go a step further and tell you, okay, what impact would these have that can integrate the research that we've all put into this and can tell us, okay, this has been seen in this place and in this time.
And whether they're metabolizing or not.
With the metabolizer as well.
Your answer.
But is the tricorder so crazy? I mean, we already have the communicator, we already have automatic doors, we already have the universal translator, basically.
Right, with the microbial and the metabolic layer, though, that would be a challenge.
A challenge, but perhaps not an insurmountable one. All right, one last question from Gloria, and then we'll break for the poster session.
I have a comment on which I'd like you to discuss, and that is considering our ancestral past and the fact that humans speciated in a tropical continent, and the fact that we have used our intelligence and technological developments to colonize new habitats for which we didn't biologically evolve. Do you think we should manipulate the indoor built environment in ways that recapitulate our environmental exposures in Africa?
I think we don't have any choice. When you see these huge complexes that are housing thousands and thousands of people, families, you see them now in China, and we're beginning to see some in the U.S. This means you've got people enclosed in maybe without even windows. So we have to deal with the indoor environment. We don't have much choice, I think.
And I would ask, would you include in that category just sort of the fermentation movement? So would going back to fermenting food, which, or making your own bread from a sourdough starter or something, those types of practices, which I presume used to really inoculate the indoor environment with microbes, would you call that kind of artisan movement now in the developed world? Would that follow the path that you're asking about?
Lynn, can we take the last two questions, or will the photographer be really mad at us and take the photo with all our answers? Okay, great. So there and then there.
There we go. Cassie Conlan, NASA Planetary Protection Officer, and I probably will extend to the beyond the previous question. In terms of environments, you've been talking about specific interventions. The presence of water and the availability of water is one more general intervention that has the potential to alter microbial populations. In addition, the selection of materials, natural wood versus plastic. To what extent is the information being gained now either being used or likely to have the potential to be used to inform the selection of materials in new buildings to support whatever targets for microbial populations are being developed in some of the assessments that are being done now?
So there is some work, and I think there's a lot more work to be done. But I think one of the really important questions we need to answer first is, an indoor material acquires a patina of stuff from the environment. And so I think one of the questions we need to resolve is, how much does that patina vary, and does that patina really govern the microbial interaction, or is it the substrate underneath it?
Yes, and of course, the obvious application to that in my context is space exploration. So yeah, thank you.
Great. And last question.
Last comment. I think there's been a lot of discussion about what we don't know about how to build new buildings, what we don't know about how to whether or not we should manipulate microbes that could potentially be protective. But the simple message is that we're mostly using old buildings, and the biggest problem with old buildings is maintenance, and also the practical pressures of those who have to maintain the buildings to conserve energy. And here we know a lot about what would be good for people. Supporting the efforts towards maintenance would be good for people. There's no question about it.
Great. Well, on that note, let's thank Paula for putting together a great microbiology of the built environment community, Lynn for running a great meeting, and everyone on the panel for some fascinating discussion. Thank you.